Chapter 8. The Reduction of Tension. In the Plant. After several weeks of negotiations between the company and the union, a settlement was finally reached which the workers accepted. The strike was ended on the basis of the following terms, which were incorporated in a memorandum of understanding. 1. A Spiedman will finish his job at the plant in another city to which he had been sent during the strike before returning to Oscar Center. This will require at least 3 to 4 weeks. B. Upon his return, he will have to work through top plant management rather than superseding management. 2. A. Ferdinand will be put in charge of mine development, air, and water problems, etc. B. He will not be in charge of a production gang. 3. A. The union and the company will get together to work out a practical understanding concerning foreman working. B. The arrangement later agreed upon specified that management was not to run the board machinery faster than related machinery allowed. That is, management was to install new takeoff and other machinery, so that the speed of the board machine would not be greater than that of other machinery into which it fed lathe. 4. All union stewards will be required to get the permission of their foreman before leaving his department. The latent meaning one of the agreement. The notion of latent meaning is one which we have implicitly relied upon throughout this study, and will be used extensively in the present chapter. The latent content of an idea, or a proposition, are its implicit meanings when interpreted in terms of a frame of refer 117. A. Delimiting spheres of authority and competence. In effect, item 2 of the agreement does the following. First, it reaffirms the sphere of competence of the mine superintendent, Old Bull, and secondly, it establishes a new office with a limited sphere of competence and authority, dealing only with air and water problems in the mine, to which Ferdinand is assigned. Similarly, item 1b is a directive defining the relationship between the traveling engineer, Spiedman, and the local plant management. It affirms the plant manager's right to sole access and exclusive authority over production workers, indicating that the traveling engineer does not have authority for direct and self-initiated contact with workers. Provision 4 of the agreement further specifies the authority of the foreman over stewards within his department. These several provisions, then, serve to specify and delimit spheres of authority and competence in the plant. B. Reinforcing centralized organization. The delimitation of authority in the plant was done in such a way as to strengthen the system of subordination and dominance along hierarchical lines. For example, item 1, in effect, reasserts, one man, administration of the plant, subordinating the traveling engineer to the plant manager. Item 2 frees Old Bull from Ferdinand's challenge and competition, installing the former as undisputed head of the mine. In short, the lines of subordination were clarified and centralization was strengthened. C. Extension of formal rules. The delimitation of authority and the reinforcement of the hierarchical system within the plant took place through the extension of formal rules. Item 4, for example, provided for greater managerial control over union stewards by installing a general rule to that effect. Still another rule is indicated in item 4b, which directs supervisors not to speed up the board machine to a point where other machines will be unable to handle the work. D. Reinforcing impersonal attitudes. Management's agreement to keep Spiedman out of the plant for 3 or 4 weeks after the ends, which takes cognizance of elements in the situation to which the participants are oriented, even though they are not fully aware of them. Cf. The essay by Abraham Adel, in M. Farber, editor, Philosophie for the Future, Macmillan Company, 1949. STRL1CE represented a tacit acceptance of the complaints about his swearing. It was a way of punishing Spiedman for violating managerial prescriptions which called for businesslike, or cool-headed, treatment of subordinates. In short, the utilization of officially prescribed, impersonal modes of behavior was strengthened by the terms of the agreement. Summing up, then, the agreement which ended the strike did so by way of delimiting spheres of competence and authority, centralizing the hierarchical system, extending the sway of formal rules, and reinforcing the propriety of impersonal attitudes within the plant. Since each of these developments is an aspect of bureaucratic administration, we can say, in a summary way, that the defense mechanism used to restore labor management relations to their equilibrium was increased bureaucratic organization. How did this happen? Why was increased bureaucratization used to reduce the tensions between workers and management? What gains were derived or anticipated from the use of this pattern of defense? Some functions of bureaucratization. It may have been noticed that items 1 and 2 both restricted Speedman's and Ferdinand's authority in one specific direction. They curtailed their direct interaction with the line or production workers. Thus Ferdinand was removed to a task involving little line authority and became a technical specialist in charge of air and water problems in the mine. It was explicitly directed that he will not be in charge of a production gang. Speidman's interaction with the line workers was also inhibited by the agreement that he would now work through top management in the plant. It is noteworthy that these two supervisors both epitomized certain tension-provoking characteristics. Both of these men exemplified the use of close supervision, and both of them had relatively few friendly and informal contacts with line workers. The delimitation of authority brought about by the Memorandum of Agreement withdrew their line powers, thereby segregating them from the production workers whose indulgency expectations they were continually outraging. As one worker explained the agreement ending the strike, Ferdinand takes care of the foul air and lighting. He's not handling men any longer, so we don't care if he's a foreman or supervisor, so long as he don't have to handle men. The specification of authority provided for by the memorandum thus had the following results. 1. It reduced the rate of interaction between supervisors who used close supervision and the line workers. It reduced the rate of interaction between supervisors and line workers who had comparatively strained or loose informal ties. 2. In effect, then, it segregated supervisors and workers who did not share complementary expectations of each other's role. 3. It thus contained or circumscribed conflicts which might otherwise arise, thereby enabling more peaceful cooperation to take place across status lines. In short, the increased use of bureaucratic administration served to reduce conflicts between different echelons, and functioned in this way as a tension-reducing mechanism. There were other ways, also, in which the strike settlement served to reduce the conflict potential. For example, the new rules specified that union stewards must first receive the consent of their foreman before leaving their department, while another rule was to be established governing the conditions under which foremen might work. Both of these rules would serve to make explicit the discretionary limits of those involved. In short, the rules clarified rights and obligations, spelling them out and making them unambiguous. It was hoped that, in this way, tensions arising, for example, from conflicting interpretations of the contract made by workers and management, and expressed in the working foreman grievance, would thereby be remedied. Actually, however, careful specification of foreman's rights does not entirely resolve the question of working foreman, since, as we have seen, this grievance was in great part a masked expression of hostility toward closer supervision. While the enactment of these rules does not reduce tension springing from close supervision as such, it does, nevertheless, provide more firmly established yardsticks in terms of which a complaint may be handled. By establishing a more definitive basis for passing upon such grievances, the rules facilitate decisions concerning their remedy and disposition. Thus, the extension of rules eases the decision-making process, somewhat reducing the role of procrastination as a conflict-creating element. Scion of rules may mend short-circuited communication channels, and in that way reduce tensions. If the use of bureaucratic mechanisms contains or reduces overt conflict, it is not, however, a peace at any cost mechanism. Indeed, it may be suggested, it reduces present conflicts in ways that increase the parties' ability to undertake future conflicts more successfully. The curtailment of Speidman's powers, and the limitations of the stewards' mobility in the plant, both reduced the possibility that the junior officers of either group, union or management, might commit their respective sides to a conflict without the consent of their supreme commanders. The new rules reinforced the decision-making powers of the supreme authorities in each camp by lessening the likelihood that those down below could make decisions which would result in unanticipated conflict. Under the terms of the strike settlement, the full-time union functionaries agreed to allow the stewards to come under greater control of their foremen. Conversely, Lakeport management consented to delimit the powers of Speedman and Ferdinand. The power of the union and company both was now more centralized, and it was less likely that the workers could once again act as an independent, third force. What had been inhibited by increased bureaucratization, then, was not merely conflict, but unanticipated conflict born of low-ranking initiative and commitments. What had been reinforced was not merely cooperation, but cooperation in greater conformity with high-level directives and plans. It does not seem adequate to conclude, therefore, that bureaucratization was adopted to reduce the tensions of the plant as a whole, nor merely because this pattern of administration aided in realizing the enterprise's formal goals, more production and profits. Instead, it was adopted because it safeguarded the specific status interests of the company and union leadership, enabling them also to realize their private goals. The main tenets of status prerogatives point to it is obvious that the formal union leadership on the local level, particularly Bida's clique, lost status in consequence of the strike. This, however, was also true for the union leaders above them, the national union's regional representatives. For the national headquarters would view a Wildcat strike as evidence that these men had lost control over the local situation. It is in part for this reason that certain of the tensions which underlay the Wildcat strike were not actually reduced by the terms of the strike settlement. For example, the procrastination of the plant manager, leading to the breakdown of the grievance machinery and to workers' complaints about the pile-up of grievances, stemmed partly from the managerial distinction between complaints and grievances. Since a complaint was a worker's claim that infringed upon what management thought of as its prerogatives, and since the distinction as a whole was a way of safeguarding management's position, nothing was done to modify this tension-provoking aspect of the situation. Indeed, each of the solutions adopted may further intensify some of the tensions which originally elicited them. For example, the increased centralization of authority which was brought about, in order to keep the hotheads in line, may lengthen lines of communication and the time needed to secure remedies of the workers' grievances. The emphasis on modifying the use of the machines, running certain of them more slowly, neglects the fact that workers' complaints about the speed up were often only symptomatic of their hostility at the accompanying changes in the pattern of supervision. Similarly, workers were not hostile to Spiedman merely because he overstepped his bounds, or cussed them out, but because he did so without being integrated in their informal system. Removing Spiedman, or Ferdinand for that matter, from interaction with line workers does not necessarily remedy the conditions which impair relations between any type of supervisor and workers. For the workers would tend to withdraw from friendly sociabilities with any supervisor who practiced close supervision. Similarly, a traveling engineer who is unintegrated in the plant's social organization will continue to face the problem of getting his work done without access to the informal social system. Management tended to expect that tensions arose when supervisors got too close to the workers. Their solution, therefore, was to remove supervisors from the situation. Management's tendency to define closeness, in the sense of friendliness between workers and supervisors, as a source of tension derived in part from their desire to guarantee the loyalty of their supervisory staff, and to keep them responsive to directives from above. Strategic replacements were insufficiently responsive to the workers' expectations and overly responsive to management's efficiency drive, that tensions arose between them and the workers. This situation was not repaired, if anything it was worsened, by heightening the centralization of managerial authority. In fine, the participants did not respond simply to the needs of the organization as a whole, but to those threats which impinged upon their status privileges, and in those ways which safeguarded these privileges. It is, in part, for this reason that certain of the organizational conditions which created disruptive tensions were not eliminated by the increased use of bureaucratic methods. At best, these were an administrative aspirin. They relieved management's headache temporarily, but since they did not come to grips with the underlying tensions, they could not effect a cure. Chapter 9. Rudiments of a General Theory of Group Tensions. Up to this point, our task was the description of a unique industrial conflict, a Wildcat strike. Hopefully, the analysis of this strike sheds some light on the events that occurred in the Oscar Center plant and contributes, generally, to an understanding of strikes and Wildcat strikes. In this section, however, These events will be divorced from their unique industrial setting, as much as possible, and will be examined in the broadest possible context, that is, in the framework of a general theory of group tensions. A wildcat strike is a distinctive type of a social tension. Yet, in analyzing this strike, we were compelled, as any social scientist would be, to employ certain general assumptions concerning the manner in which human beings behave under tension. Many of these assumptions are applicable to the study of almost any kind of social tension. What will be done here, then, is to make these broad, latent assumptions manifest, and to codify them. In this form, they will be more readily susceptible both to critical inspection and to cumulative development. It is in this sense that our objective is to outline a general theory of group tensions. The title of this chapter warns that only the rudiments of such a general theory are to be essayed. This implies, first, that only those elements deemed basic to the theory will be presented here, the frills will have to come later. One of the reasons for this is that we have chosen to tab more of a pragmatic, and less of an axiomatic, approach to the theory. That is, only those parts of the theory will be emphasized which have proved of value in analyzing our empirical data. Little effort will be made to develop those parts of the theory which can be derived from logical inference alone. 124. Secondly, there is, in the reference to rudiments, the implication that even these basics will be formulated in a deliberately crude manner, with little or no effort to define the central terms. Indeed, the charm of the proposed formulations will reside in their ready intelligibility to any educated layman. Their scientific value, however, will rest on the extent to which they can unfreeze the theory of group tensions. By requiring minimal commitments to a parochial conceptual apparatus, a framework may be erected that can shelter many theoretical mansions. Finally, it must be stressed that, as this will be a theory of group rather than individual tensions, the focus will be on strains in social systems rather than those in personality systems. It is unnecessary to belabor the obvious point that the two are connected, and that there is no tangible gulf between personal and social disorganization. Assuredly, the characteristics of individuals in a group contribute to and express group tensions. In some way, too, the disturbances of the individuals who comprise the group reflect and contribute to the development of group tensions, as well as to the attempts which are made to cope with them. In focusing on group tensions, however, the individual's neuroses or character deformations are treated as a given. Disciplined concentration is instead directed to the tensions in the relationship between individuals. To use a crude typographical metaphor, a theory of group tensions is concerned about a unit of at least two persons, A, B, and particularly about the relationship, the between them, and in what severs or unravels it. Operations in the analysis of group tensions. In the initial phases of a study of group tensions there are at least two key operations which can provide an opening wedge. The first of these is the description and analysis of symptoms. As used here, a symptom is a complaint about something. Since men under stress verbalize their grievances, by examining them, the zones of disturbance may be tentatively identified. A symptomatic complaint constitutes a statement of frustrated expectation. For example, the complaint about the speed-up expressed frustration of an expectation that speeds would not be continually varying. Complaints about Spiedman's cursing reflected violated expectations that supervisors would not overtly express aggression and disrespect for the men. A symptom, in this sense, is thus quite similar to the notion of presenting symptoms, used by doctors to refer to the patient's description of his own disturbances. For in the medical case, also, the symptomatic complaint refers to a departure from the patient's expectations concerning the manner in which his organism will operate. LL. The examination of symptoms institutes a problem in which the generic question is always, under what conditions is it possible for the aggrieved party's expectations to have been frustrated? This, in turn, directs investigation onto two parallel avenues. On one of these, the study concerns the expectations which have been violated. For example, workers' complaints about management's broken promises suggested that they expected to be able to trust and to be trusted by management. Indeed, this was a general complaint to the effect that management was not even conforming with expectations which it had deliberately given workers reason to believe they would respect. Again, the complaints about working foreman evidence the worker's expectation that foremen should not engage directly in production activities, at least under certain conditions. In short, the examination of symptomatic complaints helps to locate the frustrated expectation, or enables the analyst to make an inference about it. There is at least one important case in which this must be qualified. This is where the violated expectation is not viewed as legitimate by the complainant himself. As a result, he either suppresses, truncates, distorts, or disguises his expectation in some manner, or displaces his frustration onto some other area, and formulates it in terms of a legitimate expectation. This was illustrated in our discussion of the wage issue. In any event, if the analysis of the complaint is not confined to its general formulation, for example, the foremen around here have been working too much, and instead, proceeds by examining concrete instances of the disagreeable behavior, it is possible to get clues concerning the expectations which have actually been violated. 1C. Aubrey Lewis, Health as a Social Concept, British Journal of Sociology, June, 1953, pp. 109-124. For example, in discussing with a minor a specific case of a foreman working, his comments indicated that he did not really mind if his foreman worked, but only when the foreman did so in a manner which increased his control and power over the worker. Thus the complaint about working foreman was, in part, a masked grievance expressing resentment at the violation of the worker's expectation that there would be no close supervision. The complaint was distorted, and its real content obscured, because this expectation was only dubiously legitimate. Concurring with the investigators of the Western Electric Plant, our own interviewers found that workers by themselves were not able to specify precisely the particular source of their dissatisfaction, but that if they were encouraged freely, the effect was not merely emotional relief, but also, in many instances, the revelation to the critical listener of the significance of the complaint. Point 2. The second avenue of investigation explored during an analysis of symptoms involves the conditions which frustrate the complainant's expectations. Thus, analysis of the working foreman complaint suggests that it was a response to an actual increase of close supervision. This, of course, can elicit further problems. For example, what led to increased close supervision? This, too, created further interest in the role of succession, strategic replacements, deteriorating market conditions, and so forth. In sum, the analysis of tensions requires study both of the expectations which have been frustrated, and the conditions frustrating them, and each of these may be commenced by the analysis of symptomatic complaints. Stated differently, analysis of symptoms may lead to hypotheses about things which the complainant is defending, the things which are threatening, and the specific defense which is being employed against the threat. I take it that this is analogous with the conception of medical symptoms advanced by William Allinson White, which he characterized as the signs of combat and largely, at least, directly or indirectly signs of the way in which the organism is resisting destruction and combating death. Symptoms as such, then, instead of being symptoms of disease, using disease in the sense of an entity, and therefore bad and indicative of dissolution, need to be looked at as beneficent in essence, for they indicate how the organ to management and the worker, op. Cit. p. 269. Ism is trying to save itself from the inimical influence by which it is attacked. 3. The working foreman symptom, for example, was indicative of the threat that close supervision posed for the workers' work-oriented, authority-deprecating conception of their factory role. It indicated, further, that one of the specific defenses used by the workers was a legalistic interpretation of the contract, which limited the conditions under which foremen might work. Clearly, not all complaints have relevance to a theory of group tensions. Stated positively, only insofar as complaints do have bearing on the relationships among group members are they of interest here. Often, however, complaints are formulated in a way that obscures their implications for a system of interpersonal relationships. In general, complaints seem to be classifiable into two types, those referring to the behavior of some other persons, and those referring to some set of conditions. For example, the complaints about 4 men working, or about the cursing supervisor, are clearly of the first type. Complaints about the export order, or the speed up, of the new machine's focus, in contrast, on a set of depersonalized conditions. Point 4. The circumstances leading to these diverse formulations of complaints need not be examined here. It is important, however, to note that complaints concerning conditions can often be restated in terms of their implications concerning some person's behavior. If the relevance of a complaint for a system of social relationships is to be clarified, this is what must be done. The analyst must say, with some distortion of the bard, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves, and show how these fetishized conditions implicitly involve human behavior. For example, the complaint about the export order was important as a reminder to the Oscar Center workers that the workers in the big city plant were out on strike, and was thus 3 William A. White. The Meaning of Disease, The Williams in Wilkins Company, 1926, pp. 118-119. This distinction was first suggested to me by the work of one of my students. C. Raymond Hartle, A Paradigm for the Study of Problems of the Social Level, unpublished master's thesis, Univ C. RSITY of Buffalo, June, 1951. A validation of their own criticisms of the company management. Similarly, the complaint about the speed-up expressed, among other things, grievances concerning concomitant changes in supervisory behavior. In analyzing complaints, it should not be assumed, of course, that they constitute a valid description of some state of affairs. The question of the truth of any complaint is not the important question to be addressed to it. This is, at best, an auxiliary, useful in interpreting the meaning of the complaint, that is, its bearing on a network of social interaction. The important question, then, is not whether the complaint is true or false, but what it means. In concluding this discussion of symptoms, it need hardly be added that it should be viewed as a programmatic preview. There yet remains the hard work of codifying the operations involved in the analysis of complaints, a task which must be done before a theory of group tensions can attain to scientific maturity. Since there exist formal mechanisms for the expression and communication of complaints in factories, they are more evident and easily located in such a group. Complaints, however, exist in any group under stress. As an initial point of departure, they need to be identified and analyzed. In short, they need to be taken seriously. The identification of key statuses. A complaint is a grievance about someone's behavior verbalized by someone else. In what terms shall these persons be identified and characterized? Since the task is one of analyzing a social system, the biological or psychological attributes ascribed to people as individual organisms are beside the point. What is needed is an intrinsically social basis for viewing people, one which directly focuses on their interrelatedness. For this purpose, the most suitable and elementary notion is that of social status. This term can first be clarified by illustrating it. Social status subsumes such notions as father, mother, worker, employer, teacher, student. Any one person can, of course, occupy a cluster of several such positions, being a husband, father, worker, and union official. Each of these terms refers to a social position occupied by a person within a group. The individual occupying such a position tends to behave in ways similar to others filling the same position, and differently from persons occupying different positions. Thus, within certain groups, mothers will be found cooking, taking care of the children, shopping, and cleaning the house. Fathers will be found to be away from the home, working. One reason for these behavioral consistencies is that a given position exposes the occupant to certain culturally prescribed demands which define his rights and obligations. For example, fathers are expected to support their families. In our society, such support is normally the right of the mother and children, and they expect the father to provide this for them. Usually, also, this is the father's obligation, and he expects to provide this support. In a similar manner, the workers in the Oscar Center plant had a cluster of expectations concerning their rights and obligations as workers, which were partly summed up in the indulgency pattern. Note that social statuses always come in pairs. There is no such thing as a solitary, disconnected status. A man cannot be a husband unless he has a wife. In order to be a teacher, one must have students. Similarly, one cannot be an employer without having employees. There can be no management without workers, and vice versa. Thus the notion of status does directly concern itself with social interrelationships. But it does not do so in a way that mystically obliterates the component human beings engaged in interaction. Borrowing from Talcott Parsons, we will refer to such a pair of statuses by the terms ego and alter. Ego refers to the status occupant from whose standpoint the relationship to the other status occupant, alter, is looked at. Thus far, status has been characterized as a cluster of expected tions directed at the occupants of certain social positions. There is, at least, one other characteristic of a social status needing mention here. This is the differential power which inheres in any pair of statuses. Ego may be more powerful than alter, or the other way around. By power, I mean the ability of a status occupant, ego, to satisfy expectations despite the resistance of alter. In a preliminary state MEPT such as this, there is no point in discriminating the different types or sources of power which may exist. It needs to be underscored, however, that statuses may differ from each other, not only in terms of the expectations their occupants are customarily obligated to fulfill, but also in terms of their power. This is a point at which a general theory of group tensions must not blink, and which it must, somehow, systematically incorporate. In sum, if the first basic rule in the analysis of group tensions is that the complaints have to be identified and analyzed, the second basic directive is that the system of statuses which may be occupied by group members must be charted and the culturally prescribed expectations normally directed at status occupants must be described. Point 5. The analysis of complaints then proceeds by relating them to the context of interrelationships and expectations implicated in the network of statuses. The charting of status networks, however, is not identical with a sociometric picture of interpersonal relations. In the study of status relationships, the unit under study is not the person as such, but the person only insofar as he is an occupant of a culturally defined social status. This means, of course, that in a given group it is often possible to identify one status which is occupied by many people. The number of statuses is not necessarily equivalent to the number of people in the group. This leaves open the possibility that the relationship between two reciprocal statuses, say workers and management, may be influenced by the lateral relations which people in the same status have with each other. Obviously, the existence of a status organization, such as a trade union, and the resultant relations between union officers and followers, materially affects the relation between workers and management. Propositions in a generalized theory of group tensions. These operational preliminaries aside, a generalized theory of group tensions may now be attempted. Let us begin by committing ourselves to a common assumption which has been fruitfully formed. 5. This is similar to one of the key research directives which Merton suggests for the functionally oriented field worker. Analyzing a social pattern, he writes, involves a report of who is variously involved in the pattern of behavior. And the description of the participants or onlookers is in structural terms, that is, in terms of locating these people in their interconnected social statuses. Robert K. Merton, Social Theory and Social Structure, Free Press, 1949, p. 56. Lated by Talcott Parsons. This assumption states that the degree of tension in the relations between any ego and his alter depends on the extent to which the behavior of each satisfies the expectations of the other. From this it follows that 1. The more the behavior of ego and LTER fails to satisfy the other's expectations, the more tension will there be in their relationship. This proposition is central for the entire subsequent discussion, and it is crucial for an understanding of the analysis of the Wildcat strike. For example, the workers' complaints about management's broken promises were, in part, a colloquial reference to management's failing to comply with a variety of the workers' expectations. Following both the first and second successions, the workers' indulgency expectations were continually violated, leading to complaints about increased close supervision, about foremen who did not leave you alone but liked to throw their weight around, about the restrictions in the use of company tools and material, and about the decline of the expected, friendly, informalities with foremen. According to Proposition 1, the amount of tension will vary positively with the frequency with which a given expectation is frustrated, and with the number of expectations that are frustrated. Workers' references to the pile-up of broken promises suggest that they were not entirely unaware of this quantitative aspect of the matter. Proposition 1 is ambiguous on at least one point. It leaves open the possibility that expectations may be frustrated from opposite directions. That is, frustration can stem either from underfulfillment of expectations, as in the above examples, or from their overfulfillment. An example of the latter, discussed in the first volume of this study, one involved Peel's succession. At that time, because of Peel's anxiety in his new position, and because of his desire to make good, 6t. Parsons, The Social System, Free Press, 1951. Parsons' formulation has been somewhat modified in our subsequent statement of it. 7 Patterns of Industrial Bureaucracy, Op.Cit. A homely example of this is the annoyance of a parent when his child is overly polite, and conspicuously demonstrates his newly learned manners by thanking the waitress each time she lays a piece of silverware before him. At his better job, he tended to overconform to the main office's expectations, in part leading people there to speak of his nervousness and to complain about his overdependence on them. Alter's behavior can be thought of as providing varying degrees of satisfaction for ego's expectations, as being more or less in conformity with them. It is only rarely that Alter's behavior will precisely satisfy ego's expectations. From ego's viewpoint, Alter's behavior is satisfactory when it falls within a range of permissible variation. When it falls on either side of this zone of accepted variation, it can then be spoken of as either under or overfulfillment. 8 It is in this sense that the following is meant. 1.1. The more that ego and Alter underfulfill or overfulfill each other's expectations, the more tension will there be in their relationship. One of the reasons that Proposition 1 is so important is that, if it is examined carefully, it is possible to infer from it a large number of specific factors which contribute to an increase in group tensions. In other words, if a low degree of tension in an ego-Alter relationship exists when the behavior of each satisfies the other's expectations, it is then possible to ask, in tum, what are the necessary conditions enabling this to happen? That is, what must exist if ego and Alter are each to satisfy the other's expectations? Knowing this, it can be inferred that in the absence of these prerequisite conditions tensions will be generated. Vagueness of expectation. In the period following Peel's succession, while the new machinery was being installed, workers were found to complain about the effect that the new machinery might have on their overtime pay. They feared its possible reduction. One of the disturbances in this situation was that the workers did not quite know what to expect when the new machinery would be installed. This was a tension induced, not by the machines as such, but by management's failure or inability. 8 cf. George Homans, The Human Group, Harcourt, Brace, and Company, 1950, page 295. To clarify their possible consequences for the workers. In part, then, it was a lack of clearly defined expectation which strained the relationship between workers and management in this instance. This suggests the following general proposition. 2. Tensions will be minimal when there is some degree of clarity in the expectations which ego and Alter have of each other. Tensions will tend to increase in their relationship when these expectations are insufficiently clear or too vague. The cautious wording of this statement derives from the possibility that there may be no one-to-one relationship between the amount of te and sion and the degree of clarity of the mutual expectations. In other words, the amount of tension in an ego-Alter relationship will be reduced with increases in the definiteness and clarity of their reciprocal expectations. At some point, however, an increase in the clarity of an expectation may no longer yield increments of stability to the relationship and may, in fact, begin to generate tensions. For example, the workers complained when Peel's personnel manager, Digger, usurped the former's managerial initiative and demanded to know, who's boss here, anyhow? Nonetheless, they also complained when a foreman made his superiority openly evident and put forth clear-cut expectations of obedience. In brief, while it can be asserted that mutual expectations must have some degree of clarity, if the relationship is to be a stable one, no commitment need be made, however, to the precise amount of clarity which is required. For there exists the likelihood that some degree of vagueness may also contribute to social stability, under certain circumstances. Perhaps, however, all that needs to be remembered here is that tensions increase between ego and Alter to the extent that their mutual expectations are unclear, other things being equal. The role of unclear expectations in inducing stresses was evident in many basic features of the worker-management relation. For example, it was never very clear just how hard management expected workers to work. Nor were workers' indulgency expectations clear as to the point at which foremen ceased to be good guys and began to be slave drivers, engaging in close supervision. At least equally important was the indulgency pattern's failure to make explicit the workers' obedience obligations. Instead, it dwelled upon and ratified the workers' technological obligations. In short, workers had clearer expectations about working than about obeying. It is an example of what Harry Stack Sullivan called selective inattention. Changing expectations. Following the introduction of the new machines, when their speeds and operations were being experimented with, the workers' expectations were very confused and uncertain. As the new machines' potentialities were being explored, workers did not know what new operations they would be called upon to perform or what level of alertness they would be expected to maintain. Expressing this lack of clarity of management's expectations, particularly concerning the machine's speed, were the frequent changes made in its rate of operation. The workers resented this instability, complaining that they did not like to work in a place where things were always changing. Thus, inasmuch as the clarity of expectations in connected with their stable ity, the following seems plausible. 3. Tensions in the relationship between ego and alter tend to increase with the increasing instability of, or change in, their mutual expectations. The integration of expectations. Each of the parties to a relationship has a number of expectations that he wants satisfied, but sometimes these diverse expectations are not smoothly integrated with each other. Deficient in integration, a situation may arise where the satisfaction of one of ego's expectations results in the violation of another. Alter is thereby fixed on the horns of a dilemma. The more he conforms to one part of what ego wants, the more he outrages the other part. Thus, 4. Tensions increase in the relations between ego and alter if either, or both, has a set of expectations which are mutually inconsistent, so that the satisfaction of one expectation leads to a violation of the other. The tension between seniority and efficiency, as criteria of advancement, was a notable case in point. In the relationships between middle and top management, each expected that consideration would be given both to seniority and to efficiency. These two attributes, however, were not necessarily correlated in any one man. Thus, if a promotion was made in conformity with the efficiency criterion, it might violate the expectation that it should be given on the basis of seniority, and conversely. This same inconsistency was also discernible in the workings of the contractually required bidding system, which used both seniority and efficiency criteria as a basis for promoting rank and file operatives. Another example of the tensions arising from inconsistent expectations was observable in top management's mutually exclusive directives to plant management concerning the manner in which they should handle a complaint, as distinguished from a grievance. On the one hand, main office management expected that the plant manager would eschew legalistic methods, and would not reject a complaint, out of hand, simply because it was not dealt with in the contract. On the other hand, however, top management enjoined the plant manager to withhold official cognizance from complaints that were not contractually acknowledged, fearing gradual inroads into their managerial rights. As a result, the plant manager frequently would not know what the main office expected in a given case. He would then refer the complaint back to the main office, to the dissatisfaction of the executives there, who might complain of the manager's lack of initiative, and to the disgust of the workers, who were made to wait while the main office decided the question. The organization of attention. Before either ego or alter can reliably satisfy the other's expectations, they must be aware of them. Up to now, the emphasis has been placed upon the characteristics of the expectations, for example, whether they are clear, stable, and consistently integrated. If tensions are not to develop, however, these expectations must also be perceived, and perceived in certain ways. It may, therefore, be proposed that 5. Tensions increase in the relationship between ego and alter if either, or both, does not perceive or is not aware of the expectations of the other. Formulated in this way, there are obvious bridges between a theory of group tensions and a psychology of selective inattention and unconscious distortions. This proposition seems to refer to the kind of situation usually described as a communications breakdown. An important example of this, discussed more fully in the earlier volume of this study, 9, was observed following Peel's succession to the managership. At that time, he was so intently concerned with the expectations of the main office that he paid little attention to the expectations of his subordinates. When Peel became aware of the tensions in his relations with them, and sought to curry their favor, he found he had little contact and access to them, and that he could assess their expectations only with difficulty. Expectations. Illegitimate and non-legitimate. Not only must the expectations of each party to a relationship be perceived, if their relationship is to be stable, but they must also be defined in certain ways. Specifically, they must view each other's expectations as legitimate, as morally justified in that situation. A specific expectation is defined as legitimate, or not, in terms of the participants' values. This is, therefore, one of the important bridges between a cultural analysis and a theory of group tensions. It has been suggested earlier that a given expectation may be viewed as legitimate, as illegitimate, or as non-legitimate, which may be thought of as a twilight zone of indeterminacy between the former two. It may, therefore, be proposed that 6. Tensions increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the extent that either, or both, views the other's expectations as illegitimate or non-legitimate. The most important cluster of non-legitimate expectations was, of course, the indulgency pattern. Non-legitimate expectations generate instabilities partly because those who hold them may not press for their satisfaction with the kind of forceful conviction that calms man's attention and yields subsequent gratification. Indeed, they may, for a while, withhold complaints even when these expectations have not been satisfied, thus allowing resentments to accumulate. This seems to have been the case with the union clique organized under Bida, who failed to communicate forcefully to management the workers' grievances concerning the speed-up of the new machine's 9 patterns of industrial bureaucracy, OPCIT, and the firing of the old foreman. It was because they were ambivalent about these complaints, feeling them to be of doubtful legitimacy, that their relationship with the workers broke down, and they lost their leadership. Management, for its part, felt that the speed of the machines, and the appointment of supervisors, was their own concern and none of the workers' business. In short, they felt that the workers' expectations about these were illegitimate and, therefore, did not comply with them. Perception of behavior. Stresses develop, not only when one party fails to correctly perceive the expectations of the other, but, also, when he does not perceive the other's behavior as conforming to his own expectations, or if he sees it as violating his expectations. Alter's behavior itself may not actually deviate from ego's expectations, yet ego may perceive it in this way. Thus, 7. Tensions will increase in the relationship between ego and LTER to the extent that either, or both, perceive the other's behavior as failing to satisfy his expectations. One example of this occurred in connection with the demotion of the old foreman. The workers expected that management would give them a reason for the demotions, and complained that this had not been done. Actually, management had given a reason, indicating that these men were demoted because of their inability to control the situation and to maintain adequate levels of productivity. Not believing this, the workers failed to perceive this as a reason, and were resentful. Again, both successors, Peel and Landman, looked upon the workers as failing in their role obligations even before they came to the plant and had seen for themselves. Instead, they accepted the main office's definition of the plant situation, which led them to prejudge the workers as gold bricks. The desire for approval. Human beings usually desire and seek the approval of their fellows and, in turn, this motive disposes them to satisfy the expectations of those to whom they are related. It is an open question, however, whether they desire approval from every specific other to whom they are related. Needs for approval need not be gratified in any particular relation into which the individual has entered, nor must this need be satisfied in all of them. In part, this problem bears upon the question of the individual's reference group, the group toward whom he orients himself, and whether or not this reference group coincides with the group in which he is actually a member. This suggests the following. 8. Tensions increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the extent that either, or both, does not desire the approval of the other. 8.1 Tensions increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the extent that either, or both, prefer the approval of some third party more than they do the approval of each other. In its relations with the workers, plant management operated under conflicting directives that led them to be ambivalent about securing the workers' approval. On the one hand, they of course preferred their relationship with workers to involve a friendly respect, rather than hostile feelings. On the other hand, however, main office management cautioned supervisors not to get too close, to or friendly with workers, claiming that, if they did so, workers would take advantage of their friendship. Similarly, arithmetic apperception data suggested that Baida's group was concerned about maintaining the approval of powerful authorities. This, in turn, appears to have detracted from their need for approval by the workers, and the latter had a difficult time in keeping Baida's group responsive to their own wishes. Negative transference. In some way, it is necessary to take account of the fact that the persons occupying a given status have usually had earlier and influential role-playing experiences. These earlier experiences are significant in several ways. First, they may give rise to negative transferences, or parataxic distortions. That is, ego may come to look upon alter as if he were the alter of an earlier relationship. As a result, ego does not correctly perceive the expectations that the present alter actually has. Missive and accepting employer as if he were his harsh, demanding father. Such distortions also lead ego to define his own role in ways that violate alter's expectations. Thus, the earlier role-playing experiences may disrupt present ego-alter relationships by intruding inappropriate expectations concerning either the role of the self or the other. These earlier experiences may also influence ego to define alter as a person whose approval he does not want. This suggests the following. 9. Tensions will increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the extent that either, or both, of them perceives the other as some earlier person who was disliked. Examples of this are found in the period following the first succession, when the workers began to fear loss of their overtime pay, as a result of the improved machinery. At that time, they suddenly began to speak of the callous way in which they had been treated during the last depression, more than a decade earlier, and how their wages had been ruthlessly cut. There was the strong suggestion that an eidetic, or imaginary person was intervening in the present relationship between workers and management. In short, workers seemed to be conceiving of present management as if they were the same management of the depression period, and to have displaced the hostilities they felt toward the latter onto the current management. Distrust. The above suggests that one of the ways in which parataxic distortions impair social relations is by generating distrust, though, needless to add, this is not the only way in which distrust is engendered. As it is used here, distrust refers to ego's expectation that alter does not want to, or will not, comply with his expectations. In other words, ego sees alter as able, but unwilling, to satisfy him. Distrust is a specific type of expectation conducive to tension because it disposes the distrustful person to perceive malice where none may be intended, and thus to behave defensively where no defense is required. Such defensiveness can, however, elicit the very behavior which ego fearfully anticipates. In short, distrust acts as a self-fulfilling prophecy, which, in Robert Merton's words, is a false definition of the situation, evoking a new behavior which makes the originally false conception come true. The specious validity of the self-fulfilling prophecy perpetuates a reign of error. For the prophet will cite the actual course of events as proof that he was right from the very beginning. 10. The following proposition may, therefore, be suggested. 10. Tensions will increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the extent that either, or both, views the other with distrust. Following the second wave of strategic replacements, for example, the new foreman distrusted the workers, in part because they were new and unfamiliar to them. This acted as a self-fulfilling prophecy when, because they distrusted the workers' willingness to work, the new foreman engaged in close supervision, violating the workers' indulgency expectations, and leading the workers to behave in the very disgruntled and apathetic way that the foreman had expected. Power expectations. One problem requiring consideration is, how can a stable relationship be maintained in a power framework? More concretely, what is the effect of the differences in power between ego and alter on the stability of their relationship? It would seem that similarities in the power of ego and alter should stabilize their relationship since, in this situation, neither can get what he wants except by satisfying the other's expectations. Contrariwise, the existence of notable power disparities makes it possible for the stronger to violate the weaker's expectations with comparative ease, and with relative impunity to his own satisfactions. Power would seem to make this possible, but not necessary. Thus, it may be proposed that 1. Tensions will increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the degree that there are power differentials between them. Like the other propositions, this, too, is, all other things equal. For if similarities in power are not legitimate, they, too, may induce tensions. This needs to be made perfectly clear. We are not 10 Robert K. Merton, Social Theory and Social Structure, Op. CIT. Page 181. Merely saying that illegitimate power differences produce tensions, for this is already implied by earlier propositions. We are saying that, other things being held equal, the larger the power differential of any kind, legitimate or illegitimate, the greater the possibility of tensions arising. This is so pervasive a phenomenon that it is often difficult to see. Consider, however, the comparative ease with which Peel made a great variety of changes after his succession, changes which were made in disregard, and in violation, of the workers' indulgency pattern. No comparable set of changes, with their concomitant tensions, could have been made by any ordinary worker. Consider further, that there was relatively little that the workers could do to obtain redress for their grievances and, indeed, the full expression of their resentment at these cumulating changes was held off for 3 years. Notice, too, that these changes began to be made when the power situation had been tipped in favor of management by the deterioration of the job market. Deferred gratification. The problem of power differentials in part expresses itself as a difference in the ability to defer gratifications. The party with greater power can usually wait longer to secure his satisfactions, nor need he satisfy the other's expectations until he is ready. The party with the lesser ability to defer gratifications may have to capitulate and satisfy the stronger party's expectations, even though he does not consider them legitimate. This, of course, builds an enduring source of dissatisfaction into their subsequent relationship. It should be stressed, however, that an ability to defer gratifications is not only based on power, but is also a function of the previously developed character structure which the person brings into his role. These considerations then suggest that 12. Tensions will increase in the relations between ego and alter to the extent that either can defer gratification of his expectations more than the other. LL11 The problem of deferred gratifications was first called to my attention by FF Search on Red Tape, in which we suggested that an inability to defer gratifications was probably a character trait of those. As the work of Louis Schneider 12 and others has suggested, it is probable that middle-class people are more habituated to the deferment of gratification than are workers, e.g., they save for a rainy day, thus highlighting the significance of the deferred gratification pattern for worker-management relations in particular. Cultural conceptions of time. The ability to wait for the satisfaction of one's expectations is not only a function of the participant's power position or his character structure. It is also influenced by his culturally internalized conceptions of time, and of how long a long time is. For example, we have some expectations of how long it should take a letter to get to the person we sent it to, or of how long it should take a store clerk to bring what we have ordered. Indeed, much of the problem of red tape stems from the violation of expectations bearing on the time of performance. Thus, 1-3. Tensions will increase in the relations between ego and alter to the extent that either or both jails to satisfy the other's expectations within an expected time interval. This seems to have been an important source of the workers' complaints about their inability to get a definite yes or no from management, and about the long time it took to get their grievances processed. More generally, our references to the work of Homans and Scott, with its emphasis on the role of the runaround, suggest that the frustration of shared time expectancies plays a pervasive part in the development of wildcat strikes. 12 Schneider, Ibid. Who perceived a high incidence of red tape? See Alvin W. Gouldner, Red Tape is a Social Problem, in Robert K. Merton, et al. Editors Reader in Bureaucracy, Free Press, 1952, p. 415. C.J. The Pithy Account by Louis Schneider and Sverre Lisgard, The Deferred Gratification Pattern, American Sociological Review, April, 1953, pp. 142-148, for a systematic discussion. This work is a particularly valuable formulation of the deferred gratification pattern because the authors clearly see its implications for a theory of group tensions or, in Schneider's words, the problem of order. On constraints. There is another and very difficult problem to which we must face up. It is revealed when someone asks a question like this: it's all very well to say that a social relationship is stable when each person knows the other's expectations, when he considers these legitimate, and is motivated to conform to them. But this omits at least one important factor, namely, the person's ability to conform to another's expectations. Goodwill isn't enough. He must have the wherewithal. Quote, comma. Even if the notion of ability is somewhat vague, it is obvious that the question does bracket an important issue. One way of talking about the ability to satisfy someone's expectations is to conceive of it as a constraint, which impels the actors one way or another. In other words, there may be constraints which forbid or prevent ego from satisfying Alter's expectations, but there are also constraints which compel him to do so. For example, in the above discussion, we suggested that similarities in power between ego and Alter constrain each to satisfy the other's expectations, and that when there are sharp power differences, the stronger may constrain the weaker to satisfy his expectations without granting reciprocal satisfactions. Here, however, we are primarily interested in constraints forestalling ego's satisfaction of Alter's expectations, and inhibiting ego's motivation to comply with them. When a person says he is unable to do something, what he seems to be doing is to take certain of the circumstances in which he is involved and treat them as givens, or unchangeable. At certain times, these circumstances may, indeed, be unchangeable. Often as not, however, they are unchangeable only because the person has not thought of changing them or because he would not want to do so, even if he could. In short, commitments generate constraints. Consider, for example, the man who says, "I'd like to get my wife that new coat, she certainly is entitled to it, but I am simply unable to do so, since we're so short of money at this time, here." Ego's financial position is constraining him from satisfying Alter's legitimate expectations. Nevertheless, there are ways in which ego might get more money than he has available. He might take on an extra job, or borrow the money, or sell some household goods, or even steal it. Ego's monetary position isn't actually so unchangeable in this instance, but he treats it as such. Why? Generally, the reason seems to be that ego would be more disturbed at exercising these options than he would at denying his wife's expectations. Perhaps this can be generalized and we can say that a constraint exists when a given pattern of behavior generates tensions for ego. Ego, therefore, will be unable to satisfy Alter's expectant size when doing so creates more tension for him than not doing so. The underlying assumption here is that people tend to use options which minimize tensions, but this, of course, is assumed throughout. A variety of different types of constraints can be detected. For example, physical, biological, psychological, status, structural, and cultural constraints. Examples of physical constraints can be seen in the working rooms of the miners, which are usually darker than those on the surface, not as easily connected with each other, and distantly located from the supervisor's quarters. The head of the mine might, for example, desire to be as exacting a supervisor as his peers on the surface, yet these circumstances make it more difficult for him to do so. Again, the men at the beginning of the board machine have expectations of sociable and formal relations with each other, and would like to be friendly, but due to the way in which the machine is arranged they are frequently screened from each other's view and are unable to communicate. Here, unable can mean only that it is easier to be silent than to talk to each other and that, therefore, it is more probable that they will be silent and less friendly than the other workers. Biological constraints refer to certain mundane liabilities of the human organism, for example, its susceptibility to injury, illness, or death. Thus the worker says, "I was unable to get to work this morning because one was too ill." Obviously, all he means is that he preferred not to be carried to work, and that he preferred the ministrations he would receive at home to those he would get in the factory. Again, the death of old Doug constrained main office management to appoint a successor. His death, however, was a constraint, in the sense that it would have cost management more to leave his post vacant than to appoint a successor. Personality constraints refer to the fact that people have certain kinds of developed character traits, attitudes, or personalities, which may make it easier or harder to fulfill others' expectations. Thus, one of the reasons that Peel behaved in the rather impersonal way in which he did after his succession, thus dissatisfying the workers, was because his was a somewhat cold, rigid, or shy personality. By status constraints are meant those conditions of behavior stemming from a social status that are taken as given or unchangeable. Our initial reference to money as a constraint illustrates this type. In the case at hand, management's financial position was a constraint against the use of generous wage inducements which might have partially satisfied workers' expectations that they were entitled to more money. A structural constraint refers to those social relations which are taken for granted and which dispose ego to violate others' expectations. Thus, in the above case, management might have encountered criticism from the stockholders had they voluntarily offered the workers a large wage increase. In a sense, to risk such criticism is impossible, for the tensions it may create for management are so much greater than the tensions aroused by failing to satisfy the workers' wage expectations. More generally, plant management might like to conform to their subordinates' expectations were they not similarly constrained by their real tie-inships with their own main office superiors. Finally, cultural constraints are similar to all those mentioned above. They refer to things which are unthinkable, not merely impossible. They involve an orientation to cultural norms which are taken for granted and the violation of which would create more tension than would conformance to them. Thus the man in the first example could have stolen the money but only at more cost to himself than dissatisfying his wife. We have already noted, in an earlier statement, that tensions arise when expectations are viewed as illegitimate, because they then go unfulfilled. Here, the point is that an expectation defined as legitimate will tend to go unsatisfied by ego if he can satisfy it only by violating some other expectation which he, ego, considers equally legitimate. It therefore seems possible to propose that 14. Tensions in the relationship between ego and alter will increase when the fulfillment of alter's expectations generates tensions for ego. Is, when ego is unable to fulfill alter's expectations. The sanctioning response is now apparent that a surprisingly complex set of conditions must exist before ego can satisfy alter's expectations. In order for the relationship between ego and alter to be stable, however, at least one other major condition must be met even after ego has satisfied alter's expectations. That is, alter must respond in a positively sanctioning way. Alter must express approval or affection toward ego. He must recognize ego's conformity in some appropriately rewarding way. In part, this is so because alter's response serves as a security-giving cue, signifying that ego is on the right track. Thus, 15. Tensions will increase in the relation between ego and alter to the extent that either or both fails to give a positive sanctioning response when the other conforms to his expectations. A notable case of this occurred when management replaced the old foreman, since workers believed that seniority should be rewarded. All of these foremen had also displayed their special loyalty to the company by rejecting the allurements of higher-paying defense plants during the war, and had kept working at the Oscar Center plant. On this double count, then, the company had failed to give a positively sanctioning response to men who were held to have earned it. Lieutenant should not be supposed, however, that the relationship between ego and alter is enhanced when ego deliberately satisfies alter's expectations in calculated anticipation that this will extract a positive sanction from alter. At any rate, such a relationship is not as stable as one in which each views the other's expectations as his own obligations, thus as ends in themselves, rather than merely as a means of extracting the other's beneficence. For in the latter case, ego's satisfaction of alter's expectations is less reliable, and is more likely to take place only on the condition that alter is around to watch ego's performance and thus be motivated to reward him. Coe's supervision incites exactly such a response. The worker produces well only when the foreman is able to watch him, but goofs off when the foreman turns his back. Of course, the foremen realize this, and watch still more closely, but they cannot watch everyone at once. Thus, 1-6. Tensions will increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the extent that either or both conforms to the other's expectations only with the intention of receiving a positive sanctioning response. Defense mechanisms. Assuming that ego and alter fail to satisfy each other's expectations, the resultant tension is dependent upon at least one other important element, the operation of defense mechanisms. We assume that increases in tension may generate, more or less quickly and effectively, responses which serve to diminish the tension, that is, defense mechanisms. It would be sociologically naive, however, to assume that these defense mechanisms automatically and invariably develop in response to tensions, or that they do so with speed sufficient to cope with the tension before it gets out of hand, and that they always do so effectively. The point, however, is that when defense mechanisms do operate effectively, the tensions are reduced. The development of tensions is, therefore, a function of the defense mechanisms. Thus, 17. Tensions will increase in the relationship between ego and alter to the extent that established defense mechanisms are impaired, or to the extent that effective new ones are not devised. I take it that this is congruent with Robert Merton's observation that the key concept bridging the gap between statics and dynamics in functional theory is that of strain, tension, contradiction, or discrepancy between the component elements of social and cultural structure. Such strains may be dysfunctional for the social system in its then existing form. They may also be instrumental in leading to changes in that system. In any case, they exert pressure for change. When social mechanisms for controlling them are operating effectively, i.e., what we have called defense mechanism, A, W, G, these strains are kept within such bounds as to limit change of the social structure. 13 R emphasis A, W, G. Closing square bracket. One of the J actors contributing to the Wildcat strike, for example, 13 Robert K. Merton, Op. Cit. Page 116. Was the breakdown of the formally established grievance machinery which, in the past, had often served to reduce tensions. With the failure of this formal defense mechanism, tensions tended to accumulate. Similarly, when the supervisors' increased demands for alertness made it difficult for workers to continue using their former defense mechanism, namely, withdrawal, this, too, contributed to the mounting tension in their relationship with management. Tensions elicited by the inconsistent expectations of rewarding both seniority and efficiency were not resolved by the operation of what is, usually, a common defense mechanism in this case. That is, where there exist such inconsistent expectations, they are frequently mitigated by a defensive strategy which arranges them according to some system of priorities so that, in a given situation, one expectation is given clear precedence over the others. At least with respect to management's treatment of foremen, such a priority system did not develop. On a lower level, however, with regard to the bidding system, through which rank and file workers were promoted, the same tension between seniority and efficiency prevailed. Here, however, another defense mechanism, conventionalization, had developed and somewhat reduced the strain. In the words of Willard Waller, conventionalization arises when we agree to treat a thing as true whether it is true or not. 14 Thus it was pretended that both seniority and efficiency criteria were used to select men for promotion. Most everyone knew, however, that ability was practically impossible to use as a basis for drawing workable distinctions, and that seniority was, for all practical purposes, the sole standard employed. 1514 Willard Waller, The Family, Dryden Press, 1938, p. 68. Waller is, of course, here using Sumner's notion of conventionalization. He seems, however, to have seen it in its dynamic and defensive capacity much more clearly than did Sumner. Surely this work by Waller, as well as his Sociology of Teaching, John Wiley, 1932, must soon be again rediscovered, not merely as brilliant cases in applied or middle-range sociology, but as among the most methodologically wise studies in group tension, made both from a functional and role interaction viewpoint. 15 For fuller treatment, see Patterns of Industrial Bureaucracy. Summary remarks. In the present chapter we have sought to codify certain assumptions concerning factors that contribute to increased tension in social systems. Obviously, there is a great deal more to be said concerning these conditions. There are a great many more propositions that can be formulated and need to be tested in subsequent work. If our codification has any value, it is not as a finished task, but as another aid and stimulus to get on with the work. Clearly, all of the propositions advanced must be understood in the all other things equal sense. In the next and final chapter we shall consider the kinds of threats which are inimical to the stability of social systems, drawing once more upon our own case materials. In addition, we will return to the question of defenses, the response to the threat, and examine this more fully. Chapter 10. THREATS, Defenses, and Organizational Character. A general theory of group tensions must develop some conception of the threats which disrupt social systems. It would be unwise, though, to fall into bacteriological error, that is, to conceive of threats as if they were insular entities, as external to the social system as germs are to the biological organism. Instead, threats should be thought of as both within and without the system, as an interactive blend of elements in the system and in the environment. Perhaps, therefore, it would be best to speak of disorganization patterns rather than threats. The disorganization patterns discussed in the earlier chapters seem to congregate around two major foci. One of these is forms of social interrelations, the other is patterns of values, or shared definitions of the situation. Stated differently, we shall only concern ourselves here with the social and cultural aspects of threats, omitting any analysis of their psychological components. In the first case, ego and alter need to be seen as part of a larger, social field, consisting of many ego-alter relations, and with each person having ties to a multiplicity of others. We must now surrender the assumption that ego and alter are a latter-day Robinson Crusoe and Friday on an isolated island. In the second case, ego and alter can be thought of as involved in a larger system of values and beliefs which constitute a cultural field. We must firmly eschew any implication that ego and alter have alone created the rules and expectations governing their interaction. Neither the social nor cultural field is, of course, separable, except for analytic purposes. 151. By labeling these two situations as fields, we wish to stress that all the disorganizing influences are simultaneously present. They are not happenings in the past, but are processes in the present and incorporated in the things which people do, feel, and believe at this time. Nonetheless, these things are the outcome of certain past experiences and events. For some purposes, it becomes particularly significant to determine what these earlier experiences were. This is especially so if they are past, only in the sense that the specific ego-alter relation under study has already experienced them, but if they are not past, for other ego-alter systems. From a clinical standpoint, knowledge of such past experiences is important, even if it does not aid therapy in a given case, for it may be invaluable for prophylaxis, enabling the clinician to prevent the emergence of disturbed status in others. This is one reason why clinical disciplines, in contrast with pure or analytic sciences, are concerned with historical or genetic development. The following, then, are some of the disorganization patterns manifested in our case study, yet relevant in many other group settings. Patterns of disorganization. 1. Role conflicts and cross pressures. Ego, of course, does not have relations with one alter only, but with many. He does not occupy only one status, but several. These bring ego into contact with a variety of people, each of whom may place different demands upon him. It is, therefore, possible for one person to make demands on ego which are contradicted by the demands of others. To the extent, then, that ego is related to two or more alters who place mutually inconsistent demands upon him, then his relations with one or the other, or perhaps both alters, will undergo tension. 1. In these circumstances, ego can satisfy the expect. 1. A common case of this in industry is that of the union leader whose wife expects him to be home early, like other men, but whose work demands that he meet with workers during evening hours. Court, Alvin W. Gouldner, Attitudes of Progressive Trade Union Leaders, in W. H. Kolb and L. Wilson, Editors, Sociological Annal YSIS, Harcourt, Brace, and Company, 1949. Tations of one alter only by violating the expectations of the other. A typical case of this was the dilemma in which Bida's clique found itself. On the one hand, their formal position of union leadership oriented them to the workers' expectations that seniority norms would be respected. On the other hand, they were also oriented to the managerial emphasis on efficiency, as a prime basis for recruiting foremen, and to management's belief that supervisory recruitment was its prerogative. Bida attempted to resolve the consequent tensions by withdrawing from his official union role. The familiar conception of the foreman as the man in the middle is an endemic case of conflicting role pressures. Here, the foreman's superiors expect him to deal with his subordinates in an impersonal manner conducive to efficiency. At the same time, however, the foreman has daily relations with workers who expect him to play ball and to conform to their time-worn informal practices, e.g., those involved in the indulgency pattern. The cross-pressure situation which then emerges can be diagrammed in the following way. The cross-pressure situation, it will be seen, consists of two overlapping social systems, SS1 and SS.2. Ego is implicated in both, and he is pulled in opposite directions by the conflicting expectations of Alder L and -2. The stress develops because of ego's simultaneous participation in both systems, and because of the concurrent demands this joint membership places upon him. In short, neither System 1 nor System 2 is the germ, creating the trouble. To the outside observer, if not to a participant, it is the joint interaction of the two systems that is mutually disruptive. Going a step further, and asking, why is it that the expectations of Alders L and -2 were conflicting, it may be seen that they have both defined their situations in different ways, each being involved in different cultural systems, CS. This may be diagrammed as follows. In Beta's, or ego's, situation, the workers expected seniority to be rewarded, while management emphasized efficiency. The worker's seniority expectation was not an isolated conception, but was an integrated part of a larger cultural system, in which it was compatible. For example, seniority expectations were congenial to the second chance element in the indulgency pattern. Contrariwise, a stress on efficiency was not readily compatible with other parts of the indulgency pattern, such as government jobs, protection, or no close supervision. In short, management's accent on efficiency was more compatible with cultural system 2, which stressed rational administration, i.e., taking no old practices for granted, constantly searching out new improvements, and focusing, not on the persons involved, but on the particular problem requiring solution. 2. Authoritarian administration. It is a simple but consequential fact that ego's expectations may be more completely satisfied by one alter than by another, and that one alter may be capable of subjecting ego's behavior to more powerful sanctions than another. This is part of what is involved in any system of administration, and is particularly true in an authoritarian system. In Burley Gardner's words, when lines of authority converge toward the top of the structure, the lines of interest and attention converge too. In fact, everyone seems to be looking upward with his attention focused upon the people above him and especially upon his boss. While each boss is thus the center of attention from his subordinates, he in turn is busy watching his own boss and wondering about him. Nate's in quite a different way. He rarely worries about their opinions of him. 2. Generalizing on this, it may be ventured that relations between ego and alter will develop tensions to the extent that both are involved in an authoritarian structure in which alter -1 is less powerful than ego, and ego is less powerful than some other alter2. One of the sources of tension in the Oscar Center plan was that there was a persisting tendency, as Gardner describes it, for people to seek the approval of those above them. In consequence, each attended less to their subordinates' expectations than to their superiors. 4 men sought the approval of the building superintendent, who sought the approval of the plant manager, while the latter, in turn, directed his attention to the expectations of the main office. The resultant disorganization pattern can be diagrammed in this way. The distinctive feature of this pattern rests, not merely on ego's greater power over alter I, but in the simultaneously greater power which alter2 has over ego. As in the cross-pressures situation, this pattern can be thought of as two interlocking social systems. SS1 and SS.2. Here, however, it is conceivable that ego could satisfy either of his alter's expectations, without violating the other ones. Tensions arise because ego is less apt to perceive alter L's expectations, or because he is less interested in securing his approval. In this case, also, there are patterns of belief or ways of defining the situation which buttress the relationships, reinforcing the upward to Burley B. Gardner, Human Relations in Industry, Richard D. Irwin, Inc., 1946, page 9. Convergence of attention and the search for approval from those above. For example, the common conception that management is the brains, but that workers are merely the hands to do the dirty work, diminishes the respect and attention paid to subordinates, while intensifying the given supervisors. Top management's ability to ignore certain complaints, as distinct from grievances, as well as middle management's often irksome caution in making decisions, seem dependent upon the existence of an authoritarian administrative system in the plant. More generally, the experimental studies initiated by Kurt Lewin, dealing with the effects of authoritarian group atmospheres, indicate that such administrative arrangements induce more tension than democratic procedures, and led, for example, to more aggression, apathy, and scapegoating by the subordinates. S3. Succession and strategic replacements. During this study, two important sources of disorganization were focal succession, or the replacement of an individual occupying an executive status, and strategic replacements, or the replacement of subordinate officers made by the successor following his own succession. Since strategic replacements are disruptive of social systems in much the same way as succession, being in a sense a case of multiple successions on subordinate echelons, both succession and strategic replacement can be discussed together. Point 4. Following succession or strategic replacements, tensions may be induced for these and other reasons. A succession may inspire the successor either with fear or gratitude, and perhaps both toward those who appointed him, that is, fear or gratitude depending, respectively, upon whether his new appointment was a demotion or promotion. The new man will, therefore, be often greatly concerned about his superior's expectations and concomitantly, less responsive to his subordinates. This is a special case of disorganization induced by an authoritarian pattern of administration, as discussed above. S. Kurt Lewin, Resolving Social Conflicts, Harper and Brothers, edited by G. W. Lewin, 1948, pp. 71 ff. For fuller discussion of these patterns is given in chapters 3, 4, and 5 in Patterns of Industrial Bureaucracy, Op.Cit. Secondly, by virtue of his newness in that particular role, a successor may not know what his new alters expect of him, and, therefore, even if he wishes to, he may fail to satisfy their expectations. Thirdly, since the successor may have few friendly and informal contacts with his subordinates, he may not trust them to satisfy his own expectations, thus behaving in a prematurely defensive manner and generating a vicious cycle. In short, succession and strategic replacements induce tensions because they impair several, not merely one, of the conditions for a stable social system. Underlying these tensions there are usually divergences in the values or cultural systems toward which the successor and his subordinates are oriented. Insofar as succession takes place as one express scion of a larger drive toward rationalization, as was the case in this study, the salient values toward which the successor is oriented are rational, objective, and impersonal. If for no other reason than that the successor eagerly wants to show that he makes a difference in the situation, he is ready to try out new techniques and introduce changes. By contrast, however, his subordinates tend to remain committed to the older, traditional practices, which sanction informal deviations from the rules and acknowledge the force of established personal claims. Consequently, the successor and his alders may be involved in differing cultural systems, with the result that each defines the other's expectations as illegitimate and is unwilling to satisfy them. This disorganization pattern cannot be understood solely in terms of an elementary ego-alter system but must, like the others, be viewed as involving at least two interlocking systems with ego, the successor, playing a part in each. The situation might be diagrammed in this way. Superior a sponsor. Successor. Replacement. Ego's subordinates. Several collateral points useful in the analysis of a succession might be mentioned here. First, the changes made in the state of SS.2 are initiated by alter I, a person often removed from direct interaction with the group affected. Secondly, and this is an easily neglected problem, note that some social system has been disrupted in order to obtain ego as a replacement. Thus the need to replace one man can often generate a whole series of successions. In analyzing a succession, furthermore, attention should also be given the predecessor, the man who formerly held the position, because reactions to the successor will be much influenced by what was thought of his predecessor. This is particularly true if a stable social situation had existed between the predecessor and his subordinates, so that he was well liked. Under these circumstances, there may emerge a Rebecca myth, which extols the predecessor, thus impeding acceptance of the successor. The disruptive potentialities of the predecessor remain, therefore, whether or not he continues as a part of the group or departs from it. Another important component tension in the succession pattern involves the old lieutenants of the predecessor, the men who comprised his social circle and who were his closest assistants or intimates. The successor may fail to show the old lieutenants proper deference, willfully or through ignorance of their expectations, but in either event making them dissatisfied. This will dispose them to resist the successor and invoke the Rebecca myth, and all the more so, as one of their own number had been conceived of as the legitimate heir to the position which the successor received. Still another source of tension accompanying a succession is a pattern that may be termed the legitimation crisis. The legitimacy of a successor is accepted if he has arrived at his new position in the right way, and if, once there, he conforms to his altar's expectations. It is noteworthy that the successor may fail to win legitimacy, on the first count, through no fault of his own. Thus, the workers complained about the new foreman partly because they resented the manner in which the old foreman had been deposed. Furthermore, the workers Orton did not believe that the new foremen were any more efficient than those whom they had replaced, and they alleged that they had succeeded to their new positions by underhanded methods. Moreover, in the period immediately following the succession, there is a time of trials and tests, in which the successor must, to some extent, validate in action his right to his status. Those around watch him, as they might any stranger, to see whether he measures up. They subject him to critical surveillance and restrain the express scion of approval, before finally counting him in. During this period, they may make exaggerated demands upon the successor, or lay social, booby traps, for him, while his flaws and failures are magnified by their concentrated attention. Unsure of his altar's expectations and approval, the successor's mounting anxiety may drive him into behavior violating their expectations. 4. Technological innovations. Like succession and strategic replacements, technological innovation produced its disruptive effects not by any one of its consequences, but by the variety of unstabilizing agencies that it simultaneously activated. In the period following the installation of the new machines, when their optimum operation was not yet known, continual experimental variation in their operation induced uncertainties concerning managerial expectations. Furthermore, a variety of changes in the workers' supervisory situation imperceptibly grew out of the technological changes. New technicians, such as spiedmen, entered the plant, and the workers were unfamiliar with their expectations or considered them illegitimate. Similarly, the brass from the main office more frequently inspected the scene of activities, and the workers did not feel free to behave in their customary manner. In effect, the worker-foreman relations had been disrupted by introducing people who were powerful strangers, that is, people whose expectations were difficult to gauge because they were strangers, but nonetheless important to know, because they were powerful. Further compounding the effects of the new machinery were what may be called its fetishistic consequences. That is, with attention directed to the changes in the huge mechanical props, the actors lost sight of each other. They focused on their relation to the machinery, but neglected their interpersonal ties, creating a situation that may be called the problem of the invisible altar. This seems particularly true of management's behavior, responsible as it was for the innovations and for their successful application. In large measure, the decisions giving rise to these disruptants were made by top management, and were passed down the line to be implemented by others. In effect, the decision was implemented by reactivating specific elements in the middle management's value system, elements which emphasized the desirability of rational and efficient administration. This rational component is usually under pressure by personal ties, friendships, and informal conveniences which have grown up. It comes, in time, to be suppressed in middle management's total outlook. During a period of technological change, however, these submerged values are reaffirmed and restored to their salient position. In this way, managerial practices frustrating to the older, traditional expectations are generated. However dormant rational, efficiency-centered values may become, they are always potential disruptants of comfortable tradition. In Emile Durkheim's phrase, as soon as men are inoculated with the precept that their duty is to progress, it is harder to make them accept resignation. The entire morality of progress and perfection is thus inseparable from a certain amount of anomie, or disorganization. 5. Market pressures. Throughout this study it was suggested frequently that market pressures induced social instabilities. It was indicated, for example, that changes in internal plant relations were consequent upon changes in the plant's market environment. With the deterioration of the job and commodities market, management's power position within the plant improved, leading it to feel that it could get away with increased strictness. Another way of stating this, perhaps, is that management no longer needed, or was no longer quite so concerned with retaining the workers' approval. Speaking of the market environment as disrupting the plant's social system should not evoke an image of the plant as floating in an amorphous, undifferentiated, environmental fluid. It should, rather, call to mind that management occupies a variety of social statuses, bringing it into contact with other alders than the workers, specifically, competitors and buyers. In short, an environment. 5 Emil Durkheim, Suicide, John A. Spaulding and George Simpson Editors and Translators, Free Press, 1951, p. 364. Can be thought of as other systems of ego-alter relations, connected with those at the center of study, but differing from them in that their behavior is taken as found and need not be accounted for. This might be pictured in the following way. Alter 2, competitors. Social system under study. Not only do market pressures contribute to sudden jolts in group stability, but they also provide a source of persistent tensions. These derive partly from the kinds of definitions of the situation ordinarily associated with market arrangements. Specifically, market institutions involve an assumption that the expectations of firmest legitimacy are those which have been given explicit consent. This induces stresses because any human relation, not excepting the contractual, always involves expectations which have not been mutually agreed upon in advance. As Durkheim argued, everything in the contract is not contractual. But what shows better than anything else that contracts give rise to obligations which have not been contracted for, i.e., explicitly agreed upon a. W. G. is that they make obligatory not only what there is expressed in them, but also all consequences which equity, usage, or the law imputes from the nature of the obligation. 6 inches if we were linked only by the terms of our contract, as they were agreed upon, warns Durkheim, only a precarious solidarity would result. 7 But there is another point here as well. It is this. Market assumptions exert an unremitting pressure against the traditional, unstated, assumptions men inevitably employ, exposing 6 Emil Durkheim, The Division of Labor in Society, Trail by George Simpson, Free Press, 1947, pp. 211-212. 7 Ibid. Page 214. Them to sudden challenges and unpredictable frustrations. In short, market or contractual arrangements do not generate instabilities merely because they fail to provide an adequate foundation of specific expectations, but also because they actively corrode the other possible sources of stability. This is an important aspect of market functioning which may be termed the explicit consent disruptive. Other market assumptions also impair the requirements for a stable social relationship. For example, conformance to the market postulate that nothing should be taken for granted, but get it in writing, or caveat emptor, generates distrust, making it a permissible, if not a prescribed attitude toward certain alders. Again, the conception of the quid pro quo stimulates expedient motivations, leading ego to calculated appraisal of alder's quo before he parts with his quid. Finally, market-induced pressures to calculate consequences in advance, particularly in pecuniary terms, may impede transactions satisfying expectations, inhibiting performance within acceptable time intervals, and, also, leading to the neglect of expectations whose pecuniary implications cannot be calculated. The problem of the labor contract. Few social scientists have provided richer clues concerning the manner in which market and contractual mechanisms affect industrial stability than did John Commons. Commons noted, for example, that when the worker sold his labor to an employer he entered into an authority relationship, the economic transaction had political consequences. As Commons states, what he sells when he sells his labor is his willingness to use his faculties to a purpose that has been pointed out to him. He sells his promise to obey commands. 8. This seems legally true, at the very least, in the sense that, even in a union shop, a worker may be fired for insubordination. Commons' conception of the labor contract raises a number of questions important to an understanding of industrial tensions. For example, which commands has the worker promised to obey? Are these Com. 8 John R. Commons, The Legal Foundations of Capitalism. Macmillan Company, 1932, page 284. This is one of the masterpieces of American social science which deserves to be reclaimed from its premature obscurity and seriously drawn upon by industrial sociologists. Man's limited to the production of goods and services only? Under the terms of the contract, may an employer legitimately issue a command unnecessary for production? Who decides this anyhow, worker or employer? That these questions bracket off real tensions, rather than academic surmises, is suggested by the Oscar Center workers' frequent complaints that they did not mind working when there was work to do, but they wanted to be left alone when there was none. It seems evident that the labor contract leaves unanswered many tension-provoking issues centering around authority relations and work behavior. Karl Marx's distinction between labor and labor power also converges on the same problem, but from a slightly different perspective. Marx stressed that the worker only sells his labor power to his employer, this being the ability to work. He does not, in Marx's view, actually sell a given amount of labor or real output. In his view, tensions arose when the employer attempted to transform labor power into labor, since no bargain had been reached concerning the actual amount of work to be done. Gouldner makes a similar point when he notes, actually to the employer the labor he purchases is not a simple commodity such as a sheet of metal, which he can buy according to certain specifications as to size, weight, strength, and chemical composition, all of which can be tested beforehand, and which can be expected to remain stable. Labor as a commodity is even more perishable than a load of tomatoes, since it is the ability of a person to do work, and since this ability may vary from day to day and may be affected by all sorts of things. 9. If the worker has sold only his ability to work, in exchange for his wages, how much of this ability shall be put into effect? How much shall the worker produce while under the employer's direction? How hard shall he work? These questions cannot be answered by inspecting the contract, for typically, this binds the worker only to a diffuse promise of obedience. In short, the legitimate expectations of the parties to a labor contract, concerning both work and obedience, are unclear and vague, thus failing to provide a necessary condition of stability to the worker-management relationship. The Labor 9 Burley B. Gouldner, Op. Cit. pp. 1-171-18. Contract may be well adapted to the shifting requirements of a changing technology, but, by failing to clarify the day-to-day expectations of labor and management, it contributes little to the requirements of a stable social system. It thus becomes possible for workers and management to evaluate each other in terms of their own, unilaterally formulated conceptions of a fair day's work, so that what workers conceive of as fair is viewed as gold-bricking by management. Since obedience obligations are equally vague under the contract, it is also possible for workers to perceive managerial diligence as acting superior or overstepping the bounds. While workers have, in fact, legally committed themselves to obedience in entering a labor contract, we did not find them specifying their role in that way. Paralleling management's fetishism, workers also seem to dwell on their technological role, on their production obligations, and gave these rather ready consent. But their relationship with people, their obligations of obedience in a system of author ity, were especially ill-defined and vague. Indeed, it may be that the one-sided, but culturally pervasive, emphasis on the worker's technological function is implied by our very terms for factory roles. Common parlance has it that those on top of the industrial hierarchy are bosses, or managers, thus accenting their command functions. But those filling subordinate positions are spoken of as workers, focusing on their technological responsibilities. In a culture which stresses equality, such semantic magic may have its function, but it is a service for which a price is paid in daily stresses and strains. If a stable social relationship is one in which each party fulfills the expectations of the other, it is clear that the stability of the worker-management relationship does not rest firmly upon the contract. As Durkheim noted, other elements are required if the relationship is to be a stable one. In short, workers and management must derive their complementary expectations from sources other than the contract, from shared traditional beliefs and values. But if, on the one hand, the labor contract contributes little to a framework of clear expectations sustaining stable industrial relations, the explicit consent, disruptant within it, on the other hand, makes vulnerable all the traditional supports that could lend such stability. Furthermore, the question is not merely whether workers and management share a set of beliefs in general. The question is, do they share and utilize a set of common beliefs in their particular industrial situation? The extent of their adherence to a common set of beliefs, in this setting, could be overemphasized. For as has been seen throughout, many workers were oriented to the beliefs of the indulgency pattern, beliefs which were noticeably variant from the impersonal, efficiency-centered outlook distinctive of management. 6. Paradigmatic experiences. It is a commonplace among social scientists that men perceive, judge, and react to current situations in terms of frames of reference, derived from their past experiences. The notion of the frame of reference refers to those internalized standards which enable the person to assess and react to a stimulus. Karl Mannheim has proposed a collateral notion, that of the paradigmatic experience, which, as I interpret it, refers to the specific past experiences which group members have had, or think they have had, and in terms of which they respond to new experiences. These are not the unique experiences of any one person, but are shared experiences or shared conceptions of experience. Nor is the paradigmatic experience a generalized, abstract value. It refers, instead, to a highly concrete, complex total situation in which values are implicated. The paradigmatic experience thus underlies and gives tangible definition to a general value, but it is not identical with it. For example, the spy in the motion picture, Five Fingers, may be said to have valued money, or wealth, and was thereby led into espionage. But money or wealth had specific connotations for him. Money meant something quite different to him than it would have to another person who seemingly put a similar value on money. To Five Fingers, money meant the opportunity to become the poised gentleman he had once observed from a south American harbor, standing serenely on a penthouse terrace, immaculate in his crisp, linen jacket, and anticipating the exotic food silently placed before him by soft-treading servants. Money was thus a congeries of tactile, kinesthetic, visual, oral, and taste. See Karl Mannheim, Diagnosis of Our Time, Oxford University Press, 1944. The following account is not intended as an exegesis of Mannheim's concept, but, instead, uses it as a point of departure. Images uniquely interwoven with social symbols. This cannot be summed up by saying, he put a value on money, nor even on all the things that money can buy. In this case, the paradigmatic experience is a model to be consummated, or an experience to be recreated. It is the good time to be realized or lived anew. As such, it channels and directs behavior in the present. Conversely, however, a paradigmatic experience may be the bad time to be avoided again at all costs. This, too, influences the course of ongoing behavior. For example, there exists at least one American company, not the General Gypsum Company, which was sued in a governmental antitrust action several decades ago. But to this day, and even though its personnel have almost completely changed since then, its executives have a keen fear of another such antitrust action and bend their efforts to prevent its recurrence. Many of its current actions, particularly its energetic public relations program, are fundamentally aimed at obviating another such traumatic experience. One of the most powerful paradigmatic experiences shared by many of the Oscar Center workers was the crisis of the last Depression, and of others which had preceded it. Even the most superficial contact with our members of the working force clearly indicates that the experience of the 1930s is still very much of a potent force, a force easily neglected and underestimated in cross-sectional factory studies which ignore historical depth. Paradigmatic crises, the bad times to be avoided but remembered, are related to group tensions in several ways. First, as we noted during the 1948 negotiations, the Oscar Center workers' references to management's depression behavior served to legitimate present hostilities. In effect, they justified present conflicts in terms of past indignities. Secondly, they evoke eidetic or imaginary persons, so that the current alter is viewed as if he were the punishing or depriving alter of earlier times, leading sometimes to prematurely defensive behavior, to incorrect perception of alter's expectations, and to a distrust of alter which may be unwarranted. The relationship between the past paradigmatic crises and the present tensions is a two-way affair. On the one hand, the paradigmatic crisis may, in the above ways, precipitate tensions in a social relation. Full, legitimate, and which can strengthen the solidarity of those sharing the experience or believing in it. 7. Role discontinuities. The success with which ego and alter will perform their roles is partly dependent on the kind of earlier role-playing experiences which they have had. If their earlier roles have given them experiences in accepting and satisfying the role expectations now directed at them, the possibilities of ego-alter tensions are diminished. If, however, their earlier roles have developed expectations at variance with the demands that current roles place upon them, then tensions may be expected to mount. This hiatus is referred to as a role discontinuity. The most consequential, if commonplace, of such discontinuities were found between the earlier role-playing experiences in the small communities, from which the workers came, and the factory roles which they now played. These communities were egalitarian in outlook, though they had systems of stratification. The common definition stressed the essential equality of neighbors. Factory roles, however, required that some give commands and others obey them. Though the authority system in the factory also tended to be blurred, its system of command was much more evident than that in the community. The plant manager, building superintendents, foremen, and workers were organized as a graded system of ranks visible to all. It would seem partly for this reason that workers chafed against close supervision and were hostile to slave drivers. The experience of democratic community participation did not generate expectations congenial to the essentially authoritarian regimen of factory life. Moreover, as a small community stressing the virtues of neighborliness, the relations of community members were predominantly informal and personal. A man was judged, at least in some part, by the family from which he had come. His public reputation was influenced by his parents and their parents' past performances. It meant something to say, "Jim is the Andersons' boy." A man's idiosyncrasies were known, his personal problems and family's needs were taken into account in dealing with him. All this was not forgotten in the factory, and especially not by the workers, as the indulgency pattern suggests. Yet, the accent in human relations was placed differently. Relations tended to be more formal and official, for others outside the community had to be given an accounting. Whose boy you were no longer counted for so much. As Digger put it, relatives don't cut any ice. A man made out, or he didn't, depending on his own performance. While it was difficult for a foreman to fire a worker if he knew his wife and children, still a man was expected to keep on top of his job, or let someone else have it. Thus there were important differences here. The community and the factory were divergent ways of life. Experience in the small community did not generate expectations that made for ready adaptation to the requirements of a modern industrial plant, and thereby provided a steady source of plant tensions. The analysis of disorganization patterns. In the foregoing, a number of disorganization patterns were singled out for brief discussion. By a disorganization pattern we mean some cluster of social relationships, or culturally induced conceptions of a situation, which impairs the requisites of a stable social system, as they were considered in the previous chapter. Among the disorganization patterns discussed were role conflicts, authoritarian administration, succession, and strategic replacements, which involved the legitimation crisis, and the resistance of the old lieutenants, technological innovations, as a part of which were found the patterns of the powerful stranger, fetishism, or the problem of the invisible altar, and the perfectionist strains induced by rational values, paradigmatic crises, market pressures, partly involving the explicit consent, disruptant, and, finally, role discontinuities. Quote, in selecting these disorganization patterns for attention, it is not implied, of course, that they were the only important forms of disruption. There are other important ones, certainly. In fact, a vital part of the accumulating analysis of group tensions consists of the identification of other patterns of social disorganization. If these, however, are to contribute to the development of a general theory of group tensions, the disorganization patterns must be characterized on a broad level of generality, permitting them to be discerned in many, varied group contexts. It would seem possible, even in this preliminary formulation, to specify several operations useful in the analysis of disorganization patterns. 1. In working with ego and alter as an interacting system, treat it as a system composed of interacting parts, do not focus on the system to the exclusion of the parts. This caveat is helpful in analyzing disorganization patterns since the pattern may arise on the unilateral initiative of either ego or alter, and not necessarily because of their mutual and simultaneous action. For example, the disrupting role of succession, strategic replacements, and technological innovations were obviously matters of managerial initiative. In short, identify those whose behavior within the system initiates the tensions. 2. In analyzing pressures on the system from its environment, notice that they need not impinge simultaneously on both ego and alter but may, instead, affect one of them first. Thus the disruption produced by the change in market forces first affected management. It was primarily through management's adjustment to this that its relations with workers came to be impaired. For a dynamic analysis of disorganization patterns, therefore, determine whether environmental pressures affect one of the parties before the others, and specify which one this is. 3. In analyzing the disruptive stimuli emanating from the system's environment, conceive of ego and alter as involved in a network of many other ego-alter systems, through which the disturbances are transmitted. Thus, the plant's market environment can be conceived of in terms of the relationship between the management and its other alters, such as competitors, buyers, or sellers. This involves 3 points. First, that a system's environment itself consists of ego-alter systems. Secondly, that ego and alter are articulated with these environing systems by virtue of the fact that each of them plays several roles, and not merely one. Third, and finally, that changes in a given ego-alter relationship may be brought about by changes in the other roles which each is performing. Defenses. When the ego-alter system experiences disorganization, we assume that responses will tend to be made which reduce the resultant tensions. These responses to tensions are called defenses. A great deal of the behavior described in our case history may be understood as defensive, and it is one of the ongoing problems of developing research in this area to identify the recurrent patterns of defense utilized in social systems. As a corollary long-range goal, it is especially desirable if further research can determine the specific defenses arising in response to different disorganization patterns. For example, Roland Warren 11 has suggested that role conflicts may be coped with by a defensive segregation of roles, so that not all cultural roles are activated at the same time by any one individual. Again, he proposes that role discontinuities may be responded to by anticipatory training, that is, by early training in anticipation of future roles. A similar, but broader and more generalized, defense mechanism is suggested in Robert Merton's conception of anticipatory socialization. This involves an identification with groups in which one is not yet a member, but in which one aspires to play a role, thus inducing the preparatory internalization of expectations involved in the later role. The parallel alignment of specific defenses and distinctive disorganization patterns has clinical value, in that, when a specific defense is observed, it could be treated as a symptom, suggesting the particular patterns of disorganization underlying it. In our own research, a great many defense mechanisms were detected, though no effort was made to correlate them with types of disorganization patterns. Some of these defense mechanisms seem to be peculiar to the particular industrial context of our research, while others can be stated in ways suggestive of their application to different group settings. For example, the Wildcat strike itself may be viewed as an industrial defense mechanism which workers directed against management's use of close supervision and the consequent violation of the indulgency pattern. The same may be said of the emergence of the wage issue. Initially, close supervision gave rise to withdrawal, either in the form of quitting the job or as expressed in apathy. This, too, was a defense mechanism, though one not peculiar to factory groups. Looking at the Wildcat strike in a more general light, and in terms 11 Roland Warren, Social Disorganization and the Interrelationship of Cultural Roles, the American Sociological Review, February-Ruary, 1949, place 83-87. This is a very cogent and suggestive preliminary codification of elements involved in a general theory of group tensions. Of its distinguishable component elements, there was a circulation of leadership, from Bida to Isabos, which may also be regarded as a type of defense mechanism possible in many other situations and groups. The managerial distinction between grievances and complaints, largely a distinction between obligations and liberties, was a defense against the gradual violation of managerial prerogatives. Finally, though hardly exhausting the battery of visible defense mechanisms, there was the increased development of bureaucracy, entailed by the strike settlement. It is especially worthy of note that the defense of one party, say the workers, can create tensions for the other, management. Obviously, for example, the workers' defensive Wildcat strike was a threat to management. In other words, a defense mechanism is not merely a response to disorganization, but it may also induce a disorganization pattern. Any given pattern of behavior should not, therefore, be viewed as intrinsically either a defense mechanism or a disorganization pattern. A particular pattern of behavior might be both. Thus, strategic replacements can, as indicated earlier, generate disorganization patterns, but it is, also, frequently a response to the tension experienced by a successor, being one of the ways in which he copes with the resistance of the old lieutenants. Again, technological innovations were a defensive response to threatening market changes, but they were, in turn, also threatening to workers. Thus, in analyzing either a threat or a defense, it must always be located in a specific ego-alter relationship. For example, the technological changes were a defensive response made by management to threats which it experienced in relations with specific alders, competitors, sellers, etc. Viewed, however, in the context of management's relation with the workers, this same pattern of behavior was a threat. The notion that a threat in one ego-alder relation can be a defense in another might be diagrammed in the following way. Competitors, buyers, etc., MGT, workers. Alter 234 underscore 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 ego underscore 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 A. LTE, R, plus. ITEFENSE TE. CHNO. L. OGICAL innovations underscore threat. The selection of defenses. In studying defenses, it is a deceptive simplification to conceive of them merely as responses to disorganization. For, in leaving it at this, there is no basis for understanding why one rather than another pattern of defense is utilized. Instead, defenses have to be viewed as selective responses to threats. They are produced not only by the threat itself, but are selected and shaped by elements within the threatened sys.tem. In the next several paragraphs, we want to outline some of the elements influencing the selection of defense mechanisms. One way of examining this question is to raise a key problem. What is the defense defending? First, it may be suggested that the defense is defending the relationship between ego and alter, and, by maintaining it, enables each to secure continued satisfactions. A defense such as bureaucracy appears to operate in this manner. It would be a grave error, though, to suppose that all defenses function in the same way. For example, insofar as withdrawal, especially quitting the job, serves as a defense, it certainly does not result in the maintenance of that worker's relationship with that management. It clearly severs it. It is conceivable, however, that the withdrawal of certain intensely hostile persons might strengthen the relationship among those remaining, but this is debatable. There is a second type of answer indicating what the defense is defending. It may be posited that another of the things being defended is to be found in the specific status occupied by ego or alter. In other words, defenses may be chosen in terms of their ability to safeguard status interests. At any rate, this heeds our earlier injunction that, in focusing on the system as an interacting unit, we should not lose sight of the interacting parts. For even if ego and alter have joint recourse to a single pattern of defense which serves to maintain their relationship, nevertheless, each of them may still be gaining something different from it. For example, management's selection of the various forms of rationalization, namely, technological innovations, succession, and strategic replacements, cannot be understood solely as a response to threatening market conditions. For an alternative defense, heightening the workers' morale and willingness to produce was largely neglected. The defenses chosen were uniformly characterized by their accessibility to managerial control, while the defense rejected might have made management dependent upon a resource on which it could not rely. More concretely, management preferred to forego joint labor management determination of machine speeds, as one way of enhancing workers' morale and motivation, since this infringed upon what management conceived of as its status rights. Similarly, the managerial distinction between complaints and grievances has, as we saw, all manner of disturbing effects upon the worker-management relationship. Yet management developed this distinction since it served to fortify those of its rights which it considered essential and proper for its status. In short, certain defenses were selected because they protected status positions, and, perhaps, especially, the differential advantages and opportunities involved in them. Ego and alter choose defenses, then, not only in terms of their contribution to the system as a whole, but also because they defend their position in the relationship. Another element influencing the selection of defense mechanisms are the values of those initiating the defense. Ego or alter will prefer defenses which are legitimate in terms of their own values, and will tend to reject defenses they define as illegitimate. For example, the expression of aggression against supervisors by workers, a form of defense, was inhibited insofar as workers considered supervisors to be members of their own sociable, primary groups. When, however, the interaction between the new foreman and the workers declined, and when supervisors were no longer counted in as members of these primary groups, workers could permissibly express aggression toward them. Again, when management violated the workers' indulgency pattern, the kind of defenses which workers could employ were affected by their conception of the indulgency pattern. That is, since workers did not view this pattern as having clear-cut legitimacy, they could not use formal, contractual mechanisms of defense against its violation. Instead of making public demands for contractual redress, they invoked the Rebecca myth, staged guerrilla forays such as the Wildcat strike, or displaced their resentment into a defense of firm legitimacy, like the wages issue. Not only will considerations concerning the legitimacy of a defense affect its selection, but expedient considerations also play a role. For even though a given defense is deemed legitimate, it may, nonetheless, be rejected if it is judged to be ineffectual. When, for example, management began to tighten the bit and exert closer supervision of workers following the end of World War II, it did so because it believed that lax wartime habits were improper, and, also, because tightening up was now expedient in view of the increasing scarcity of jobs. Even if a defense is both legitimate and expedient, it still is not always possible to use it. For example, a defense needs to be congruent with the personality structure of those using it. In discussing the motivations of Baida's clique, it was noted that they typically derived much of their security from submission to authority, and that they ordinarily inhibited the expression of aggression. These men would, of course, find difficulty in using a wildcat strike as a way of defending themselves. Another basis for the selection of defenses relates to the conceptions held about the causes of the tension. Not being automatons, the people involved will have some notion of the causes of the tension which they experience, however correct or incorrect it may be. They will respond, in short, in terms of their understanding of what brought it about. For example, insofar as certain workers, particularly those in Baida's group, believed that the strike was brought about by a misunderstanding of the contract, supposedly made possible by its ambiguities, they favored the elaboration of bureaucratic rules to eliminate the areas of uncertainty. Again, management's conception that labor management strife stemmed from close relations between foremen and workers encouraged it to reduce tensions by getting rid of the often old foremen and putting in new and unfamiliar ones, strategic replacements, and by increasingly regulating their relations with workers by impersonal, bureaucratic rules. Generally, there seemed to be at least three distinguishable conceptions which people in the plant had of tension causes: the naturalistic, the utilitarian, and the voluntaristic, each of which disposed them toward different patterns of defense. The naturalistic conception viewed tensions as rooted in the nature of things, perhaps in human nature, and thus saw them as unremovable. For example, there was widespread violation of the no smoking rule in the plant. Since, however, smoking was widely viewed as an uncontrollable expression of nervousness, few efforts were made to change the pattern. Laissez-faire is a response to a naturalistic conception of tension causes. I made it this. It maintained that the strike was a spontaneous eruption from below, and an expression of irrational feelings, to which a section of management responded by prescribing catharsis, that is, allowing things to run their course, in the hope that this alone might remedy matters. A voluntaristic conception of tension causes attributes the difficulty to someone's intention. It does not view tension as the unanticipated consequence of certain activities, but as the deliberate end of the people involved. Such a definition of tension causes frequently elicits punishing and aggressive responses. Thus, the main office production department, in particular, viewed the strike as a deliberate stratagem of the workers to enhance their control over the plant. They were then inclined to join battle with the aggressive expectation of showing them who is boss. In the utilitarian view, tensions are thought to be generated accidentally, being due, perhaps, to the ignorance of the people who bring them about rather than to their malice. A frequent defense against tension so conceived is to educate the offenders. This conception appears to underlie the company's human relations program, with its use of motion picture strips and discussion sessions, providing some education in the difficulties of human relations. Before the participants in a social system can have some conception of the causes of the tensions they are experiencing, they must, of course, have some degree of awareness of the tension itself. The degree of awareness which they have of the tension will, further, affect their development of defenses against it. In the extreme case, for example, where there is little or no awareness, defenses can develop only in a groping trial and error manner, in an unthinkingly reflexive or habit-dominated way. Our defenses may be brought to bear on the tension only, too little and too late. This appears to be the case during the introduction of the new machines when, because management was attending to the technological problems these created, they neglected the dissatisfactions which had developed among the workers, permitting them to grow unchecked. People also seem to use standardized cues, which enable them to detect tensions. When they see these, even though they may perceive them without full awareness, their defenses against the tensions begin to be mobilized. Men working something was wrong in labor management relations, even if they did not know exactly what it was. Quite commonly, Management uses demands for wage increase as a clue to an IM pending or existing tension. Certain tensions may arise and remain unnoticed, however, where the participants have not developed cues signifying their presence. There did not, for example, seem to be any standardized cues, which management used at any rate, heralding the collapse of the formal union leadership. To sum up this section, among the forces acting to select certain defenses, and to reject others, were the needs of the relationship among the parties involved, the status interests and pressures of these parties, their values, their judgments concerning the expedience of the defense, the psychological constraints acting upon them, their awareness of the tension, and the conception of the tension's causes. Organizational character. In the analysis of defense maneuvers, there is at least one other problem of major importance, a problem which may be termed the career of the defense. That is, the stability or duration of defenses will vary. Some will be used and then quickly discarded, others will become stable and be built into the organization's routine. Where this happens to a defense, that is, where it becomes a stable part of the organization, it becomes a part of what can be called organizational character. 12 By organizational character, I mean the organized total of all the stable, recurrent, defenses employed by a social system. In short, it is the cluster of methods commonly used by the group to cope with disorganizations. It is, in this sense, that the term bureaucracy best refers to a type of organizational character, rather than to a single defense mechanism, for when we inspect what it means, it can be seen to refer to a large variety of connected mechanisms. For example, it reduces tensions and conflicts by the integrated use of delimited spheres of authority and competence, formal rules, centralization, impersonal attitudes, and other devices. 12 I believe that this notion was first used by Philip Selznick in his provocative, TVA and the Grassroots, University of California Press, 1949, and L. later elaborated upon in his Organizational Weapon. McGraw-Hill, 1952. So far as I can judge, however, I have borrowed Selznick's term only, but not the way in which he employs it. The career of a defense depends upon as large a number of factors, indeed frequently the same factors, as are involved in its selection. In the final analysis, the success or failure of a defense depends upon the resistance with which it is met, and the ability of those sponsoring the defense to overcome this resistance. This is another reason why the emergence of defenses is always problematical, and is never to be viewed with a mechanical optimism which assumes that for every threat there must arise some effective defense. One of the important reasons why defenses are resisted is precisely because they may act effectively against some threat. It must be remembered that a threat is not a capricious, playful force. A threat is some system's defense, and as such, is anchored deeply in a social relationship. It is not likely, therefore, to be relinquished lightly. Actions against threats, defensive maneuvers, will, therefore, be resisted, because they are actions against some system's defenses. 13. Defenses against threats are, therefore, threats against defenses. Less paradoxically, defenses against threats to one system will act as threats against the defenses of another system. Since the defenses of one system are the threats of another, the more successful defenses are apt to be those which minimize their threatening aspect, or, as Harold Lasswell might say, reduce provocation. An example of this may be found in the use of Ferdinand and Speedman as scapegoats. Use of a scapegoat reduces provocation since it implies that the changes sought are minimal, and can be brought about with little alteration of organizational fundamentals. This interplay between defense and threat can be illustrated by summarizing their role in the Wildcat strike, which can be done in 3 basic episodes. Episode 1 Equilibrium. During and shortly after the war, labor management relations were comparatively stable. The workers were producing according to the traditionalistic expectations of old Doug, who didn't push the machine. Management was performing its role largely in accordance with the expectations involved in the indulgency pattern. 13 By far the best codification of the concepts of resistance and defense is to be found in the fine article by Herbert E. Krugman, The Role of Resistance in Propaganda, International Journal of Opinion and Attitude Research, Summer, 1949. Episode 2 Disorganization and Defense. Changes took place in the market. It became harder to sell goods, harder to find jobs. Old Doug died. A. These changes threaten management. B. Management defends itself by initiating several successions to the plant management. Old Doug is replaced by Peel, and the latter by Landman. Management simultaneously introduces new machines, and other changes on the middle management level, the strategic replacements. this new supervisory staff engages in closer supervision. C. These management defenses in turn threatened the workers, violating their indulgency pattern in particular, and challenging their technologically centered conception of their factory role. D. The workers responded to these threats with their own variety of defenses, including aggression, apathy, and, finally, the Wildcat strike. E. These, in turn, threatened management, who feared for its control of the plant. Episode 3: Development of Organizational Character. A compromise settlement was reached which, in effect, resolved the strike by increasing bureaucratic mechanisms. Possibilities of conflict were minimized by introducing rules which made explicit both parties' rights and obligations, and provided clearer standards for settling grievances. The plant was further centralized. The traveling engineer and stewards, both, were subjected to closer line control. The plant was restored to greater stability. Overt conflict ended. This, however, was by no means a return to the situation as it had been, for, as a result of the defenses employed, the organizational character of the plant had been changed in a more bureaucratic direction. The commitment to this organizational character did not, however, eliminate many of the tensions underlying the strike and, in fact, left open the possibility of their renewed expression. The organization's lines of communications had been lengthened. Informal relations between workers and supervisors remained undeveloped. Close supervision was eliminated only insofar as two of its foremost practitioners, Spiedman and Ferdinand, were concerned, but the apathy and resistance which could produce it in other foremen went unchanged. Nothing was done to make supervisors more responsive to the workers' indulgency expectations. For these reasons, several weeks after the strike settlement, the workers began to talk again of another walkout. In brief, the defensive measures which were agreed upon did not resolve the tensions, but initiated a vicious circle. They did not dissipate or eliminate the tensions, but caged them in. The development of a vicious circle is a crucial event in the career of a defense system. It developed here, largely because the people who had the greatest influence in shaping and selecting the defenses, namely the union officials and top company management, focused on those organizational needs which happened to coincide with their own status interests, and thus, for example, arranged to curtail the unsettling initiative of their own junior officers, but they failed to perceive that in doing so they impaired or neglected the requirements for the plant as a stable social system. These, then, are rudiments of a general theory of group tensions. Such a theory is a strategic bridge between a pure sociology and an applied one, between a sociology whose central concerns are prediction or understanding, and one which searches for the step beyond this that can provide men with a guide to action in their time of trouble. The cumulative development of a general theory of group tensions is the first item on the scientific agenda of those seeking a clinical sociology. 7071727311111098765543. Sociology. Gouldner has utilized the context of the strike to formulate a theory of group tensions and a conception of the threats which disrupt social systems. Wildcat strike is a research report interpreted by role analysis within a structure-function framework. Theory and research are blended so successfully that industrial sociology becomes here, as it should, a contribution to general sociology. Delbert C. Miller, American Sociological Review. The author has three objectives: to describe a wildcat strike in detail, to explain why and how it happened, and to develop the rudiments of a general theory of group tensions. Each objective is accomplished with clarity and perception. Primarily sociological in orientation, the study contains materials of practical moment for union and management representatives and of factual and academic interest for students of industrial relations and group tensions in several disciplines. Provide S. genuine insight toward the author's goal of erecting a bridge between pure and applied sociology. Van D. Kennedy, The American Economic Review, Harper & Row, Publishers. Coyer design by S. Zagorski.